All right. Well, good morning and afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to talk about animal per diem rates. I'll start off by introducing myself, and I will pass it along to others that are here to present with me this afternoon. I am Kari Kelly. I'm a director in the EDR practice at Huron. I've been with Huron almost 19 years. My expertise lie or surround a lot of costing type work. I have a lot of experience with F&A or facilities and administrative rate calculations, and all things that kind of fall under that costing umbrella. I've spent a lot of time working with institutions on service center rate calculations, fringe benefit rate calculations, and animal per diem rate calculations. And I'll pass it over to Neil.
Hey everyone, my name is Neil Villani. I'm a manager at Huron Consulting Group. I have over 6 years of experience in kind of research administration and the costing team, same as Kari. So I've worked with colleges, institutions, universities on their F&A indirect cost rates, as well as service centers, animal per diem rates, kind of everything under that costing umbrella. With that, I'll pass it over to Michelle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Chardon. I have been in the higher ed realm a little over 17 years now. I've been with Huron a little over a year on the costing team, working. Most of my experience has been in post-award finance and service center rate calculations, F&A calculations, all the costing items, cost accounting items, just like the other people mentioned here. But yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing my experience with you today. Next up, we have some colleagues that joined us today from UCLA and USC, so I'll let them introduce themselves. We'll start with Dr. Goodwin from UCLA.
Thanks, Michelle. Jeff Goodwin here from UCLA. I am the attending veterinarian and the executive director of the animal resource group called DLAM here, Division of Lab Animal Medicine. I've been in the business for over 30 years as a lab animal vet. I've been a director of a program for coming on 20 years, maybe 18 years, something like that. So I've been doing this for quite a while, and we've been been fortunate to work with Huron for I think about maybe 5 years. We've gone through a few recalculations with these guys. Ravi.
Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everyone. I'm Ravi Ryan, the CAO, CFO for UCLA Division of Laboratory Animal Medicine. I've been in animal research for a little bit over 4 years in my current role. I've been in the UC system for over 18 years, but primarily in pre-award, post-award, and a variety of other roles. So I'm excited and look forward to this presentation.
Good morning, afternoon, everyone. My name is Andres Chan. I'm currently the director of the Office of Financial Analysis at the University of Southern California. While I've, over the weekend, hit the milestone for 15 years there, nevertheless, I've been with higher ed for about 24 years, pretty much all in the costing world. Pretty much everything that the Huron team mentioned, I do. And in particular, as it pertains to this topic, I also oversee all the recharge center activity on behalf of the university. So I'm also looking forward to what they have to say about this. So,
Thanks,
yeah.
So to kick things off, we just wanted to do a quick poll question on when the last time was that your institution calculated or recalculated your animal per diem rates. All right. And then I think Neil will show the results. So it looks like just under half have gone through the calculation in the last year or two, with some not exactly sure, and then maybe some within the last 5 years. So thank you guys for sharing that with us. So we're going to start off by just talking about what is an animal per diem rate and what goes into the process of this calculation and why is it so important to an institution. So a per diem rate is really that cost of to care for an animal or a cage of animals for a single day. So when you think about an institution and the various species that they may have within their animal facilities, all of them are going to draw different costs. They're going to draw different salaries of the employees working with them. Some are going to be more time consuming. Some are going to have specialized bedding or feed. So really, what are all those costs that go into the operations of that facility? And then what are the costs within the operations that are attributable to a specific species? So really, we're going to, through this process, assign all the costs to the individual species, divide them by the total care days, and then calculate a per diem rate. So I know it sounds really simple, but as we kind of break this down, one of the things that we usually start off talking about with an institution when we work with them is really understanding what the standard of care is. And, one thing to recommend is if that's not something that's accessible to your users, you'd really want to make sure that that is. So everybody that would be a user of your facility really understands, what's the standard of care and what are the services that are really included in that per diem rate they're being charged. And that can vary from one institution to another, which can be a contributing factor to why you might see variations in rates for species. But really making sure you understand that. And on the flip side of that as well is that if you are billing for different services in addition to your per diem rates, you also want to ensure that you're not double recovering those costs. We'll discuss this a little bit further in future slides, but just ensuring that you're not duplicating that cost recovery. So through that process, you really are going to break down the operating costs into direct cost centers and supporting cost centers. And again, these might vary from one institution to another, but essentially you want them to accurately reflect your essential components of your facility, or what are those daily functions and operations that are taking place within your facility, and how are they contributing to the various species. So direct cost centers would be costs incurred for husbandry of animals or other services provided for the benefit of a specific project, where you would really be able to establish a billing rate or directly assign those costs to an individual species. Support cost centers, they might not be as quickly or readily assignable to one specific. So you have to kind of group those and allocate them using various metrics. And so some of those might be general administration, general sanitation, cage washing, animal health care. This next slide here, this just gives a really rounded example of what we call activity codes, or those indirect cost and direct buckets that you would use in a calculation. So this is really spanning, a lot of daily operations or activities taking place. So you have animal husbandry, enrichment of various species, costs related to facility management, general administration. And so as you kind of think about these costs, some of these costs might be able to be directly assigned to a species. You might know that a specific bedding or feed is attributable to only, one or two kinds of species, or there's going to be some that don't benefit from bedding. And then there might be some other things where general administration that's overarching and it's supporting the facility as a whole. And so kind of how do you allocate those costs appropriately out to the individual species? At a very high level, and we will walk through these steps in more detail as we move through the presentation. At the starting point, when you're embarking on the animal per diem rate calculation, you're really going to review the state of your current operations and understand what are your current per diem rates. Are they cost-based? Are they something that's just been, increased by 5% for the last 10 years? Really understand the history of them. And then you'd start to gather the necessary data for the technical service rate calculations and just all of the operating expenditures that go into the facility, understanding any subsidies that come into play, and how those, are also being applied and accounted for in the calculation, and then really developing that rate structure. And also understanding, what species, and sometimes that can fluctuate. And we've seen, as Jeff said, we've worked with UCLA 5+ years, and we've seen fluctuation in various species where there could be a guinea pig coming in, and historically you haven't had a rate, and there are no costs in the last fiscal year. So how do you kind of approach that situation? So then once you kind of put together, what makes sense for your institution in terms of activity codes and species, the rates that you want to move forward and calculate, you're going to create a custom model That's going to allow you to input all of that information with the output being that rate calculation. One of a key step, and we will talk about this in a lot of detail, is a time and motion study. And it's great to have both of these institutions here because even with just UCLA, we have approached various methodologies to this throughout the span of working with them. But typically, your salaries are equate to, could be 60% to 80% of your operating expenditures. And this study is used to allocate that, and we'll talk more about that. So ultimately then, output would be calculating cost-based rates that you would want to continue to review on an annual basis. So some budgetary considerations, so now after kind of walking through at a high level, what kind of goes into that per diem rate calculation? Well, why update these? And why have we partnered with institutions? So, we've been engaged for various reasons. It could be an audit finding. It could be just really wanting to understand the operational costs. It could be an institution's looked at their peers and see what they're charging, and they think they're charging something much lower. It could be for the need to ask for a larger subsidy, or maybe your institution doesn't have one, but really does need that contributing to the operation expenditures, and really also compliance. So kind of looking at these, you want to make sure you're implementing cost-based per diem rates. You want to make sure that if you have rates that are outdated and really haven't been reviewed in detail in multiple years, that you are reviewing those annually. You want to ensure that they're charging federal projects. So there's a compliance around that, making sure that they're being charged cost-based rates and not a higher rate than another user. Another benefit is the transparency. So it really improves transparency to the rate structure and the overall calculation. You'll hear lots of PIs are always going to point out, this institution has lower rates. Over here, I see this, and they'll go on and try and talk about that. And so, we've partnered with institutions where we've been able to actually present to research groups on campus once we've gone through and calculated to really show what the true cost is. And more oftentimes than not, that cost is still not fully being charged and recovered. And then just simplifying the cost structure, developing rates that represent the cost and species, and then having that model that will allow you to utilize this as you move forward and do reviews on an annual or biannual basis. And so when we think about budgetary considerations as well, when I talk about compliance, so you have the OMB uniform guidance. And so when we think about, charging federal projects, or you have users that are charging federal projects, there's the NIH cost analysis rate setting manual. So the model that is built will mirror these guidelines that are very specific to the animal per diem rate calculation, which would vary from other service center operations on campus. And then just institutional policies, ensuring that you guys are adhering to those and they're being considered when reviewing and calculating your rates. So the expense allocation, as I was discussing, the study really does provide an insight into what those true operating expenditures are. And so I also mentioned that sometimes what we end up calculating is still much higher than what the market or your users on campus can bear. And so you might only still raise those rates 2 or 5% or whatever that may be. But this whole exercise really provides that transparency and gives you that overall operation, picture. If your institution has a subsidy, it may want to apply it in various metrics. You may be using it to purchase equipment. It may be subsidizing specific species that are going to be utilized more by your users on campus. And then that time and motion study really does allow visibility into kind of where are people spending their time and how much, how many employees are doing things. We've seen lots of things come out of this study where it's just like, wow, we didn't realize this species is drawing this much cost, or different things of that nature. So it really just gives that overarching picture and understanding where the dollars are being recovered and kind of where they're originating. So challenges when updating per diem rates, I know I mentioned this earlier, is more often than not, sometimes we've been engaged with an institution where they have not gone through this in quite some time, or maybe it had been done prior to them joining. And so not having that history, using outdated rates, you know, you don't know that they're cost-based. They could actually be too low, that you could be overcharging. So, you know, really understanding what the true cost of your operations and calculating a cost-based rate is the overall goal. Sometimes the data needed and necessary for the calculation is never needed to be pulled in that manner, or you're not really sure, you know, how much of your expenditure data can you tie back to an individual species? Maybe none. And maybe we need to, you know, brainstorm other ways and metrics to kind of do that. So kind of the first time you embark on gathering that information, sometimes that could, you know, be a little bit more difficult. And then aligning data. So you're always going to be, you know, calculating data within one fiscal year that's going to be applied or implemented in a future year. And so kind of understanding what those inconsistencies may be. As I mentioned, it could be a fluctuation in various species. You could know that costs are increasing, and understanding what revisions or enhancements you can do to that calculation to get it as close to being accurate and as effective as when it's going to be implemented. And then also just quantifying that subsidy amount, and ensuring you understand how that's coming into play within the calculation.
Right. Thank
All
you,
right.
Tori.
Yeah.
Thank you up until now. So I think we're a little eager to kind of get started, but we did forget to mention a little bit. If you have questions, by all means, I think we have several folks here on the call that are going to be manning, looking for those, so we may be able to answer those towards the end of the presentation. So by all means, any questions you have, just post them to the chat and we'll go ahead and monitor them. But having said that, you know, this is pretty much everything that Kari has talked about up until this point. You know, we ourselves at USC we had the same concerns. We went through a similar process. Then just so you know, at USC, we just had them finish this process just a few months ago. Prior to that, I remember meeting with the director of the animal resources there. It's called DAR, Department of Animal Resources. And he really had not done an actual rate analysis for probably over a decade now, because that's how long I had spoken to him. But I think as you're looking at just these 4 boxes, you kind of understand why there may be an impression that we would have been okay. You know, just on the top left, we're talking about standard care, right? Standard costs there for DMs, et cetera. You know, there's a very different component process for how these are laid out and calculated compared to some of the other ones across campus. As I mentioned to you, I have pretty much about 80 recharge centers that I'm responsible for from a central perspective to ensure that they're in compliance. This was one where I really felt that we needed some work. And while my office and my team, you know, they're well aware and versed in how to do recharge center analyses. You know, this is one of those where, quite honestly, if you skip over now to the next box over there, if you haven't seen the NIH CARDS manual and you're having problems sleeping at night, I mean, I urge you to look at this document because it's pretty substantial. It's very detailed. And you know, quite honestly, we only have really one on campus. Pretty much every university just has one if they have one at all. And so it is a process that's very detailed. There's a lot of components that go into it beyond just your standard, you know, what you think of a cost structure, right? You're thinking of salaries, you're thinking of your supplies. This takes that to the next level. I was part of the process with the with. So, you know, wrap your head around that as you're planning this. It can be very time consuming. You know, subsequent to this, they did such a fantastic job in terms of, you know, fully costing out, which I think is one of the biggest differences between the other recharge center. You really have to look at its entire cost structure to develop these rates. And in the process, you understand kind of where everybody's contributing their part, and oftentimes they may be contributing in different ways. Now on the call, I have some colleagues from UCLA, and quite honestly, I can't tell you how many times I hear, you know, UCLA is doing this, or you know, Caltech is doing that, and we always come back with the same thing. And just this morning, as we're prepping, I was talking to the folks. we're coming to find out that we are very different in terms of what subsidies we receive, because yes, we may operate in the millions of dollars, but the subsidies that they get are very different than the ones that we get. Not only that, the type of subsidies are very different as well. And so now that we have an actual rate calculation that's fully costed out, we have additional challenges. And then really that is, how do we implement them? If you went from a mice at $2 a day and now they're telling you, a fully loaded mice is $2.50, 50 cents doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about millions of mice, that's a substantial increase in cost across the board. And so we've had to kind of figure a mechanism for two things. One is we want to maintain our rate structure. Basically going forward, we want to learn and we want to understand the process so that we can keep up with it. And secondly, we also want to, as we're addressing our subsidies and in our environment, they're reducing over time, that we can also increase rates just large enough so that you don't scare people off either. But at the same time, socialize and educate that, this is a true cost and really is necessary for us to go this route. And it also allows for the preparation of the proposals going forward in terms of, shell shock, when you get a bill at the end of the day. And as I mentioned, the subsidies is a real thing because, there's financial subsidies, but there's also, depending on how you're budgeted or structured from a university perspective, space can be determined differently in terms of the cost of the space, as well as, there was this perceived notion, for instance, that the departments were actually paying a fee up front to help subsidize this, and they weren't really understanding the link between that pot of money and the actual end result. And so it created almost this false sense of, I already paid for this, why am I going to pay for it again? So you also have to go through this educational process with them to help them understand the big picture. So all in all, like I said, it can be a complicated process, definitely time consuming, not just for the people doing it, but there's a lot of effort involved at the lowest possible level. As you'll probably hear Neil go through some of the processes where it could be time consuming. We just appreciate the help. And like I said, now we have a sound foundation. Year one, I wasn't allowed to vote earlier. I'm a presenter, but had I done it, I would have said 1 to 2 years because we just did it. And I hope to continue it. As I heard earlier, UCLA has done this the last 4 or 5 years with them, and it can only help the process going forward. So thank you very much. Neil, I yield to you.
Thanks so much. I think you made a lot of good points. So I think what we're going to go next on is the model overview. But before we do that, I wanted to launch another poll question. How successful is your institution at implementing those per diem rate changes? So do you change your rates every year? Do you intend to change your rates but end up not? Or do you not raise your rates and don't really intend to raise rates in the future? Okay, I'll stop it now. Share the results. So I think it's pretty even between some people are changing their rates every year and some people aren't. And I think that is an institutional question of, have you done your per diem rate calculation, or what was the history of those per diem rates? So with that in mind, let's talk about the basic steps of the per diem rate calculation. So you want to start with a full year of operating costs. So a lot of times you'll be using a year to calculate or to actually get the per diem rates for a future year. After you get your full operating costs, you want to identify your activity codes that Kari was mentioning. So your direct and your indirect support kind of groupings. You want to accumulate those costs there using your financial systems. And then you have the option of that time and motion study. Michelle will kind of talk about the different ways you can actually conduct a time and motion study. You might be able to impute it, or you have to go through the whole process of surveying everyone. You then want to allocate those costs of those different buckets. And then you want to put those costs to individual animal species for your entire center. And then you want to take those costs, divide it by the number of units or those care days, and then that gives you that equation, and then that lets you know how much each indirect animal species cost and what you can charge them for the next fiscal year. So I think the big parts of this, or the more time-consuming areas, are going to be between the steps 3 to 6. Accumulating all those costs and then allocating them out really do take the most amount of time, and making sure that you're allocating them appropriately and you're able to bring them to those individual species. So there are a couple of different ways that you can allocate those costs. One way is to direct assign. So when you're thinking of things like feed, bedding, and sometimes even enrichment, there are only a few different groups of species that might be using a certain bedding, or they might be eating a certain feed. So you can actually carve those costs out and directly assign them to your individual species. The other option, when you're thinking about costs that benefit the entire facility, so it might be some of your facility management costs, those can be allocated by your entire census or all of your different care days. So those animal species that have a lot more care days will brunt more of those costs. The other option is to do a total assigned cost. So when we're thinking of things like general administration, those benefit a lot of different activity codes. So you can actually allocate that using those total direct assigned costs. And then you have the time and motion study. So when you're thinking of salary and wages, we like to allocate those based on what people are actually working on. So what are the cage washers doing? What are the people in husbandry? What animal species are they working with? So you can allocate that bucket using time and motion study imputed or actual study data results. So this kind of graphic kind of shows you start with your total expenses. You have your salary and wages, and then your non-salary expenses. You remove anything that's unallowable. So things like those animal purchases that are charged directly to individual PIs, those pass-through, those technical services, everything that is already being recovered, you kind of want to remove that. That also includes things that you're recovering through your indirect cost rate. So there might be certain costs that you're including in your F&A rate calculation. So working with the group at your institution that's calculating the F&A rate and making sure that you're not double counting costs in both calculations. And then once you remove all of those costs, then you have your total adjusted amount. And that's what you're actually going to use for your animal per diem rate calculation. So this graphic again shows your total operating expenses. You take those and then you bucket them into your different activity codes. So you split those costs into general administration, cage washing, healthcare, husbandry, etc. And then you'll take those specific buckets and allocate them to each individual animal species. So you might say, okay, cage washing, 90% of those costs related to cage washing are related to mouse and rat cage washing. After that point, you would allocate those costs, and then you would divide those costs by your animal care days. And that's what gets you that end per diem rate number. So some things to really consider and to add adjustments to is you want to include any vacant positions with anticipated salary and fringe costs. So if you think about it, this rate is going to be used in their future fiscal years. So if you already know we're hoping to hire 1 or 2 extra cage washers or 2 extra positions, we can actually build that in, impute over time and motion study to figure out what will they particularly be doing. And that way you have those anticipated costs into your per diem rate calculations. Very importantly, like I discussed, you want to remove all of your pass-through and your animal purchase costs, all of those things that are being recovered, because you don't want to double count or double recover something. And sometimes what that means is you can combine or reduce rates to better represent species on site. So if you have a species that doesn't have many care days, you might want to combine them with another species and kind of treat them the same. And that just helps with reducing the amount of outliers. And when you have those animal species with not a lot of care days, it does skew the rates in particular directions. It's also harder to allocate cost to those individual species just because they're not there the entire time, or you just started getting those into your center. And then we've been discussing the subsidy, but deciding what are you subsidizing? Are you going to do a blanket subsidy? Are you subsidizing certain feeds, certain bedding, certain activities? Discussing and applying a variable subsidy is a very important part of this calculation as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Michelle to talk about the biggest component of this, that time and motion study. And she'll go through just the different ways that you can go through the time and motion study and what to really consider.
Yeah, thank you. I think first we have a couple of poll questions about time and motion study. All right. So the first one, on average, how much do salary and wages account for your in total operating expenses? Yeah. All right. If you want to share. Oh, we're sharing. Okay. Okay, so it looks like, we typically say between 60 and 80%. So it seems that everyone is falling, a lot of people in the 40 to 70%, and then some in the 70 to 80%. So definitely usually the majority of your cost. All right, let's see what's the next one. So in your last calculation, what type of time and motion study have you conducted, if you did one? Yep. All right, thanks, Neil. So yeah, paper-based is the most common form. So I expected to see that. Imputing hours is also another method that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But yeah, so thank you for your participation. So I do want to talk about, I feel like everybody has been alluding to the big bad time and motion study. So I'll break it down for you, and it's not as bad as it sounds, but it is a time and labor intensive process. But it is something that will get you a result that is desired and definitely compliant. I want to talk about why it's important, some methods for completing the study, and then we'll talk a little bit about the data output and how you can utilize that data, maybe even a little beyond just the per diem rate calculation. So if you remember from the model overview section that Neil talked about the different allocation statistics that were used to allocate your costs down to the activity and species level, the time and motion study is the primary way that we gather the data to create that statistic for your labor costs. And since they're your largest expenditure, being precise and accurate is, the primary goal of the time and motion study. When you're going through this process, you're primarily looking at two things. What activities are your staff working on, like animal husbandry versus cage wash, etc. And two, with those activities, what species are they working on? So first, let's look a little bit more about what even is a time and motion study. So in a nutshell, a time and motion study is exactly what the name says. It's a log of the activities and the species that are being worked on for the duration of the study. It's typically a 3 to 4 week study. We typically have everyone everyone in the research animal facility complete the study. Obviously, that's a big undertaking and it's time intensive. So getting everyone on board is one of the primary challenges when launching a time and motion study. Also determining when to do it is key because you want that study to reflect your normal operations. And it never fails that something will occur that's not normal operations during that time and motion study. But if that happens, there's always an adjustment period after we get the data where it's reviewed by everyone and kind of normalized. So just be prepared for that. And finally, the ways that the information is gathered, there are several different methodologies. Paper forms, like you saw in the poll question, are pretty common. We've been utilizing online survey tools, which are very similar to the paper form, just in a web format. And then imputing numbers is another option. And no matter which method that you choose, there'll still be some review for accuracy, and there'll be adjustments made at the end. So actually, let's look at the different data collection methods in a little more detail. So paper-based forms, still the common method. You basically have everyone fill out the form every day. The main challenge with that is that you have to have someone take all those paper forms and enter it into an electronic format, so it's very time intensive. And I'm going to skip over here to the right side, the mobile web form is really the same thing as the paper form. It's just in an electronic format. So the benefit there is that, you know, you don't have to do that second step of the paper form because you're already gathering it in an electronic format. There are some challenges with that method. Access to technology is not consistent for everyone, especially if they're out on the floor. So that can make the mobile capturing method more difficult. And they both still require a review by your management at the end of the day. The third method in the middle here is using the imputed hours. This is less time intensive because it's done at the supervisor level. Basically, the supervisor says, this is what I think my people are working on. This is what activities they're doing. This is what species they're working on. But the con here is that since you're using estimates, it's not as accurate as the other two methods. And so there's a lot of different factors at play when deciding what is the best method for your institution. But you should, you know, it's an institutional decision, and you should just go with the method that works best for your unique situation. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show briefly just a couple of examples of what the paper and web-based forms look like. So you can see here, this is the paper-based form. It's pretty straightforward. It's broken down into 15-minute increments, which that's the standard that we use because activities can switch pretty frequently. And sometimes, you know, for those activities are billed in 15-minute increments. So basically, the participants of the time and motion study log the activity they're working on using the activity code, and then they put in the species. And of course, this one is just representative, an example, but you would change up the activities and the species for your institution. And next slide is the web form. You can see here, it can be done on a phone even. They just scan that little QR code, which is nice. And then it brings them straight to the web form, or they can do it on a computer as well. The premise is the same as the paper form. You're basically selecting your activity in 15-minute increments. And then for those activities, the species that they're working on for those activities, they just check the little box. You know, and if you can use this method, sorry, Neil, and if you can use this method, the second part of the data analysis is much faster because they'll come out in an Excel file just ready for you to start analyzing it. Okay, next. All right, so that was some quick glances at the data collection methods. But once you have all that data, what do you do with it? So let's look at this example of a staff person who completed a time and motion study. We start here at the top. This individual makes $30,000 a year, and in their time and motion study, they logged 90% of their time was spent doing cage washing activity and 10% doing general admin. So that $30,000 basically gets split $27,000 to cage wash, $3,000 to general admin. And then under their cage wash time, they also said, okay, 40% of my cage wash time is spent cleaning mice cages, 60% is spent cleaning rat cages. So they're of the $27,000 assigned to cage wash, it gets split even down to the species. So those costs are assigned directly to the species. So that allocation, well, let me back up. The general admin cost, you can see here, this 10% was $3,000. So that $3,000, because it's general admin, gets spread across all species. So that allocation, that same logic of breaking down the cost using these statistics from the time and motion study gets applied to everyone who completes the study. So in the end, you will be able to confidently say that your salary and wages are allocated appropriately down to each species. You could trace back each position, each person, their cost down to the species. So let's do a quick recap. Your main purpose is to get a good estimate of everyone's effort by task and species, and using a time and motion study is in conformance with the NIH CARS manual, and other, you can make sure that you're being compliant if you use this method to allocate your salary and wage costs. There's many different ways that you can complete the study, but the more precise you can be, the more accurate those allocation statistics are going to be. And that means your per diem rates will be more representative of the true costs to provide the services. So let's see. One more takeaway that I wanted to share with you guys today is that you have all this data that you've gathered over 3 to 4 weeks. And yes, the primary purpose is to develop this statistic for the per diem rate calculation. But, you have all this data, so there are opportunities to use this data for more. I do want to say, sometimes there's some politics around doing this type of study and it can be viewed as kind of like a performance measure. And I would steer away from using this data for that, but it can give you some insights into what activities your staff are working on and how much time is being spent with the different species, and that can help inform your decisions in the future. You may end up surprised by some of the outcomes, or you may find that things are operating exactly, as you expected. Dr. Goodwin, do you have any thoughts, on how UCLA has used time and motion study, or, on the methodology of collecting the data in your experience?
Michelle, I have lots of thoughts on that. I'm happy to share. Yeah, I've always been a big proponent of time and motion studies, and I actually kind of learned them from some of our, operations staff at one of my previous institutions, and I brought those types of studies here. And so, yeah, we, the Huron team's been really great at letting us kind of use the types of studies that we're comfortable with. So I'm very happy about that. I don't know if people know, if you've talked to people in the industry, time and motion studies, whether you use them or not, or how you use them, it's a little controversial. Everyone seems to have their own idea of what's the best way to do it. So again, Huron kind of let us use what we thought was important. So what we did at UCLA was we actually did, I think, like 2 types of time and motion studies. So the first was before we even started working on the rate analysis. We did kind of a time and motion study where we sat down, and I think probably everyone does something like this, where we sat down with probably a handful of technicians and the supervisors. We came up with a list of everything that those particular teams did. So if this was a husbandry technician in a mouse room, we came up with a list of every daily, every weekly, every monthly, quarterly task that they do for those mice in that room. And then we literally, with the stopwatch, actually time those tasks. And a lot of those tasks are kind of repetitive, like a cage changing. So and they do that for many hours of the day. So we don't have to time, we don't have to time it for hours and hours. We can take a snapshot of 15 minutes and how many cages do they get done in that, and kind of extrapolate that. So that's really what we did to start with. And the reason we wanted to do that is really to get our FTE numbers, our FTE counts, and make sure that we were comfortable with that before we did the other time and motion study, as we've been talking about earlier, the paper-based version. The information that we gather this way, people typically will put in some spreadsheets. We actually have kind of a fancy new computer module that we put all this information in, the tasks and the times, and it actually creates a schedule for us. And so when we do all this work and we put in the times, we can see a schedule, and we can see where people maybe have more time in their day for more tasks, or maybe where they have too many tasks. And then we can kind of adjust accordingly. We can give them or take away some tasks so that at the end, we basically have like the number of FTE that we need for our institution. It doesn't really work. This method doesn't really work for everyone. It really only works for like the husbandry techs, the cage wash techs, maybe even the animal health care techs that are kind of doing the same repetitive things over that you can capture in this way. It doesn't really work for the veterinary team or the administrative team or myself. I don't do the same tasks repetitively enough to do it this way. But anyway, my point is we wanted to capture our FTE needs first, and then we went about starting the time and motion as part of the per diem rate calculation. And for that, we did I think we did this time the electronic paper-based way of doing that. Because we have this kind of new electronic system that I mentioned, we worked with Neil, and actually I think it worked out pretty well. We were able to really capture for those people that we could do the time and motion study that way. I guess it's kind of like an imputed method in that we were just kind of giving him the information instead of making them fill out the forms. But it was all we went through a whole process of capturing that information. So I think I was really comfortable that those times were really, spot on to the minute that, okay, this person was doing something in husbandry for a mouse or a rat or whatever, 11 minutes or 27 minutes or whatever it is. So I think that was really good. So the combination of that and then the method that we've described here, paper-based, I think worked really well for us. And I think this year I was really part of the process from start to finish. And I think we're really comfortable. As you guys mentioned, the salaries are like 60% of your costs. So getting a good, you really want to get this right. And so, doing time and motion studies and really getting as much accurate information as you can, super important. The one other thing that I would mention about time and motion studies that we've found out every time we've done this is that the training on the training before you do the time and motion study is like super important. And I know, again, we've used Huron the last few times, and so they've really done that training for us, but really important before you start, because you kind of get one shot at this, if you're starting a study and you haven't really trained your staff on exactly what those activity codes mean, for instance, then all of a sudden day one, well, doesn't matter, training or no training on day one, people are going to be like, checking in with you. I'm not sure what this means, or I'm doing this certain kind of task and I don't know where it falls. So definitely a learning curve for learning how to fill those out. And the more training you do at the beginning, the better. I think those are my comments. Time and motion studies. I think Neil's up next.
Thanks so much, Jeff. That was a really good explanation on kind of the different intricacies of the time and motion study and combining those two kind of ways together. So after the time and motion study, I think we just wanted to talk about the rate calculation part, but I will launch our last poll. So in this question, what was the methodology used for your most recent per diem rate calculation? So did you go with a flat percentage increase? Did you do a model calculation? Did you mirror peer institutions? Just no change at all? Okay, so I think it's the highest percentage was around that model creation. Few people did go with a flat percentage increase or no change. So thank you for sharing that information. So I think the end result, after you've done all of your cost bucketing, you've allocated everything, you get your list of species, you get the total cost for those species, you have your care days, and then what is that calculated rate? After that point, you can go through those, compare them to your current rates. Some rates might have gone down, some might have gone up, and then you can see the difference between your calculated rates and your current rates, and then decide, what are the PIs, the other researchers willing to bear? What do you want to subsidize? And you go from there. But I think that calculated number and your total cost number is really important because that gives you, okay, this is what it would cost for us to break even to recover everything for the animal center. So let's say you were going through the time and motion study and you had a few animal species that weren't present during that 3, 4, 2-week period, whatever it might have been. What do? So in that case, you can create some sort of provisional rate. So for those animal species not present, what you can do is determine a reasonable cost basis to estimate the per diem rates. So maybe they were coming from another institution. You can determine how much costs were included in that per diem rate calculation and almost have like a temporary rate to charge while you conduct a time and motion study and determine what are those true costs at your institution. The other way is you can estimate the rates based on similar rates for similar species. So if a new animal species requires the same bedding, the same feed type, maybe even the same cage washing estimations, you might want to charge, for the time being at least, charge the rate for the similar species. And then again, in the future, do that time and motion study, determine your true costs, and then calculate and charge a true cost-based rate. The other option is you could utilize benchmarking to understand the rates at other peer institutions and then ensure that the rates that you're calculating through those other means are cost basis or even competitive in the area. Now, I know I just talked about benchmarking, but it's not always apples to apples. They might not always be accurate or cost-based, and that's because different institutions get different types of subsidies, and they might have differing structures of the operations. So you might be treating a certain cost in the animal per diem rate, but they might be recovering that cost separately, so not including it in that per diem rate calculation. They might have different standards of care. They might be applying a subsidy in a different way. So when you see rates published or not published at different institutions, it's not always easy to compare them because they could be using a different model, a different calculation. I think it's a good idea to just see what are the rates in that area. But it's not always the most accurate to just increase them or just grab them from other institutions or other benchmarking metrics without knowing exactly what goes into those rates. So talking a little bit more about that benchmarking, I kind of mentioned it could be a differing structure, could be inconsistencies on how costs are being included or excluded compared to your institution. But I do think it's important to at least note and understand how or what other people are charging for your species and understand, what is going into those rates, right? So if an institution is charging a substantially lower rate for a species that you're charging much higher for, talking with them and understanding, okay, what is driving those costs to be much lower? Are they spending more on their subsidy to cover those costs? Or is there other operation things that maybe you could implement in your own institution to slowly reduce those costs and reach a consensus rate? So I think it's important to at least have those benchmarking metrics, but just understanding that, whatever your true costs are, those are the true costs for your institution. You have your current rates, so at least you have that starting point, and then you can make determinations from there. So I think with that, these are a little bit summary of the different key points that we just talked about, but I wanted to hand it off to Ravi to talk a little bit more about UCLA's rate calculation, some of their goals, and how their rate calculation ended up as well.
Thank you, Neil. Hi, everyone. So UCLA DLAM's annual budget is in the range of $25 to $26 million. And so that's not enough to cover one year's salary for LeBron James, but luckily, he's not on our roster, so that's a good thing. So back in 2015, UCLA had basically some of the highest rates in the country. And this is prior to Dr. Goodwin's arrival in 2016. And once Dr. Goodwin arrived and some of the rates had kind of stayed flat for some time, Dr. Goodwin was able to basically negotiate and secure an annual $4.4 million annual campus subsidy. And this campus subsidy basically comes from ICR, so indirect cost rates. So basically the calculation, which was done back in 2015, takes into account the DLAM users and the total direct costs and the total DLAM recharges to identify like a percentage of the total direct costs and use that percentage to calculate. And that's how that $4.4 million calculation was done. And we've been receiving that annually for a little bit over 7 years now. And generally, DLAM increases rates about 3% annually. But as we all know, with COVID and just inflation recently, we've had to adjust for that. So for example, current fiscal year, we've adjusted the rates to 5%, and it will probably be a little bit higher with this next fiscal year as well. The other thing that I've noticed the last couple of years is that the gap between the true calculated rate based on our work with Huron and the actual rate that we end up charging or the subsidized rate, if you will, is pretty significant. But that gap is now closing with our greater increases in terms of the per diem rates. 95% of DLAM revenue comes from 4 major categories. So that's kind of something to consider. So for DLAM, mice standard, mice autoclave, mice breeding, and mice HASCON are kind of major drivers. I remember recently we did a presentation to the dean, and the dean was under this assumption that, primates were one of our biggest drivers. And that might be the case, for example, like for one of our sister institutions like UC Davis, but definitely not the case for us. So that's something to kind of consider. UCLA started the rate calculation process with Huron sometime mid to late March, and we're just at the end of this week. We're going to be finishing up and submitting that to the UCLA Sales and Service Committee. But UCLA started working with Kari and Neil back in almost January in terms of the time and motion. So there's a whole process that goes into place in order to get the rates ready. And so again, you guys all might be on like a different timeline, but the UC new fiscal year starts July 1st, so we try to get the rates ready in time and give the Sales and Service Committee kind of time to review and approve that. Another thing I wanted to mention is it's important to account for all costs. Don't make any assumptions. Dr. Goodwin's really great and emphasizes a lot with all of our managers and supervisors to ensure that all operational staff are accounting for their time, their supplies, just any kind of like ad hoc kind of like one-time services that they might be providing to the investigators. Especially given for sales and service units like DLAM, we don't have a lot of other sources to kind of generate revenue, if you will. So it's important to account for salary and benefit increases for union, non-union roles, including cost of living, step increases, feed and bedding, and just other operational costs. The other thing I want to kind of highlight, I think Neil mentioned this previously, but Huron uses the data from a full 12-month period, full year's worth of operating costs, but sometimes that data might be 2 years old. For example, current fiscal year, we're almost 10 months through this year, but they're not using current year. So we try to make sure that we kind of work with Huron to account for that, and if there's any kind of significant changes and how that might impact the model. And another great resource that DLAM kind of takes part in is, I don't know if you're all familiar with the Yale Animal Resource Cost and Benchmarking Survey that was recently done. I believe the data is not out yet, but it basically kind of gives you the national rates, rates by region, and just a lot of other really useful information. Another thing that UCLA does is we reach out to a lot of our other sister campuses on various rates to get an idea of how our rates compare to theirs. I think Neil kind of touched on that earlier. And the other thing to kind of keep in mind is that the other UCs also receive a subsidy, but some of it might be a percentage or a flat dollar amount, and it's not, again, apples to apples as Neil had mentioned previously. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to mention is as far as per diem rates. So for example, current as of July 1st, DLAM is going to provide the new rates for fiscal year 24-25, but we also give the researchers and the faculty a 3-year outlook so that they can plan accordingly when they're applying for, let's say NIH contracts and grants. So they'll have a 3-year outlook of what those rates are going to look like. And generally, we don't kind of go above those increases that we've projected for them. And I think one of the things that Dr. Goodwin and I are kind of big on is kind of just having flexibility in terms of the rates, and especially given our $4.4 million campus subsidy. So it kind of gives us that flexibility to control a little bit as far as the rates and what that revenue is going to look like for that next year. And of course, you want to look at like care day increases or any kind of drops. And potentially also for us, another important thing is just space. Taking into account new faculty, and Neil touched on like new species. For example, we had a faculty member coming from University of Texas last year, and it was bringing a new species of marmosets. And what we did is we looked at the rates that University of Texas had, but also we looked at one of our sister campuses, UC San Diego, to see how they came up with those marmoset rates, and we kind of use that provisional kind of rate for that first year. And now we have better kind of time and motion and kind of a better understanding of what those rates should look like. And it really kind of helped us for this next fiscal year. So that's everything that I had. And so I'm going to hand it off to Kari for, I believe we're going to close with Q&A.
Yes, thanks, Robbie. I believe that we've answered all the questions that have come through the chat. And if anyone has any more, I know we're at time. We plan to send the recording of the webinar and the slides out to everybody who attended. So we really appreciate your guys' time this morning or afternoon. And if you have any additional questions, our contact information will also be included here. We'd be happy to further discuss. And thank you so much.